The vault door sealed at 1447 local time. I recorded the timestamp out of habit, though time measurement will become meaningless within days. The manual wheel turned 7 complete rotations before the locking bolts engaged. I counted each one, feeling the vibrations through the rockcrete floor. Outside, the city of Memorial Hold contained 4,300,000 citizens. Inside, I sat alone with 3,000 years of history stored on data slates, parchment scrolls, and cogitator crystals stacked floor to ceiling in climate-controlled preservation units. My name is Archivist Secundus Matthias Kale. I have held this position for 22 years. Before that, I was a junior scribe in the administratum offices, sorting tithe records and planetary census data. I was 31 when they promoted me to the archive sanctum. I am 53 now. The gray in my beard started appearing at 47. I mention this because physical details anchor memory, and memory is all I have left to preserve. The air in the vault tastes of old paper and recycled oxygen. The environmental systems maintain 18 degrees Celsius and 40% humidity. Optimal conditions for document preservation, less optimal for human comfort. I am wearing my formal robes, the heavy gray fabric lined with red thread that marks my rank within the administratum hierarchy. The robes smell of incense from this morning's daily observance. I conducted the ritual in the main archive chamber, as I have done every morning for 22 years. 3 prayers to the Emperor, 7 minutes of silent contemplation, notation in the daily log. That was before the sirens began. The evacuation order came at 11:23. Governor Tallis himself transmitted the message through every voxcaster in the city. His voice carried the controlled panic of someone delivering news he still could not fully accept. Citizens of Varos Prime, this is your final evacuation notice. All remaining personnel are to proceed immediately to designated embarkation zones. The enemy fleet has entered orbital space. Resistance is no longer viable. The Emperor protects, but we must flee. I did not flee. The archive sanctum is designated a priority Sigma cultural site, which meant I was authorized, expected to defend it until relieved or destroyed. But relief would not come. The Imperial Navy had withdrawn 3 days ago after losing 2 cruisers and a battleship to whatever force was descending on our world. The planetary defense forces evacuated yesterday. The last civilian transports lifted from the spaceport this morning. The sky above Memorial Hold is empty now, except for the approaching enemy. I have not seen the enemy. I have only seen the reports, biological signatures that do not match any known xenospecies in the administratum archives, ship configurations that defy standard classification. Communications attempts met with silence, then with transmissions that caused 3 Vox operators to suffer catastrophic neurological collapse. The Medicae could not explain what happened to their brains, only that exposure to the enemy's broadcast had liquefied portions of their frontal cortex. After that, we stopped trying to communicate. The vault contains the complete recorded history of Varos Prime from initial colonization in M38 through last month's census data. 3,417 years of births, deaths, wars, famines, triumphs, failures, all documented and cross-referenced according to Administratum's standard archival protocol. I know this archive better than I know my own life. I have spent 2 decades preserving it, cataloging it, defending it from humidity and insects, and the slow degradation that consumes all physical records. Now I am sealed inside with it, waiting for the enemy to arrive. I have a chrono that displays both local time and Terran standard, a Vox receiver tuned to the planetary emergency channel, a luminator that casts harsh white light across the nearest stack of document containers, enough nutrient bars and water reclamation tablets to sustain me for 40 days, a las pistol with 2 charge packs, and a recording servitor, currently inactive, that I will use to document everything that happens here. The recording servitor is an older model, its brass casing tarnished despite my maintenance efforts. It has a vocabulator that produces speech with tinny mechanical inflection. but its memory crystals can store approximately 600 hours of audio before requiring data purge. I activated it once already, to test functionality. The servitor's designation is Archive Unit 7. I have been speaking to it for 5 hours now, dictating this log because speaking aloud makes the silence less absolute. My hands are shaking. I noticed this when I pressed the record button on the servitor's activation panel. The tremor is slight, but measurable. Physiological stress response, not fear exactly, but the body's recognition that circumstances have exceeded normal parameters. I breathe slowly, counting to 4 on the inhale, 4 on the exhale. This is a technique the Schola Progenium instructor taught us during combat stress conditioning. I was not a good student then. I preferred books to battlefield preparation. Now I practice the breathing and find it helps marginally. The Vox receiver crackles with static. No voices. The emergency channel has been silent for 3 hours. Before that, there were scattered reports from citizens who had not evacuated, trapped or hiding, or simply unable to reach the embarkation zones in time. A man asking if the transports would return. A woman calling for her son, speaking his name over and over with increasing desperation. Children crying in the background of someone's transmission. Then, at 11:47, the transmission stopped. Not gradually, abruptly, as if everyone speaking had simultaneously lost the ability or desire to continue. I stood in the main archive chamber listening to that silence. Around me, preservation units hummed with their climate control functions. The luminator strips cast even light across row after row of shelving. Everything was in its designated place, sorted according to the system I had spent 22 years perfecting. And outside, 4 million people were either fleeing, or dying, or already dead. The scale of that number felt abstract. I could not visualize 4 million deaths, but I could visualize the archive. Each document, each data slate, each carefully preserved fragment of knowledge. That I understood. That I could protect. The decision to seal myself in the vault was not heroic. It was practical. The enemy would come. They would enter the city, search the buildings, destroy or consume whatever they found. But the archive sanctum was built during the M39 fortification initiatives, when Veros Prime served as a sector capital and required facilities capable of surviving orbital bombardment. The outer walls are reinforced plasteel 3 meters thick. The vault itself is buried 40 meters below ground level, accessible only through a single entrance corridor protected by blast doors. The environmental systems are self-contained, powered by a plasma generator with fuel reserves sufficient for 90 days of continuous operation. Inside this vault, the archive could survive. I could preserve it until the Imperium returned, until liberation forces arrived and reclaimed this world. That was the reasoning I followed when I descended the access corridor and activated the vault's sealing mechanism. Practical, logical, necessary. I did not think about how long I would remain alone here. I did not calculate the probability that liberation forces would arrive within my lifetime. I focused on immediate action, seal the vault, activate the environmental systems, conduct an inventory of supplies, break the situation into manageable tasks, survive by not contemplating the implications of survival. Now, 5 hours after sealing the vault, I am beginning to understand what I have chosen. The silence here is different from the silence of the empty city outside. This is the silence of the tomb, of space cut off from the world, of consciousness continuing in isolation. I speak into the recording servitor to fill this silence, to preserve not just the archive, but some evidence that I existed here, that someone witnessed the ending of Veros Prime. I am seated at my workstation, a desk made of local timber, imported from the northern forests before the logging operations ceased 8 years ago. The surface is worn smooth from 2 decades of use. There is a water stain near the left corner, where I once spilled recaf during a late-night cataloging session. My hands rest on this surface now, and I can feel the grain of the wood through my palms. This sensory detail anchors me. The desk is real. The archive is real. I am real, at least for now. The luminator flickers. Just once, a brief interruption in the power supply. The plasma generator is functioning within normal parameters, but the flicker reminds me that all systems eventually fail. The environmental controls will last 90 days. The nutrient bars will sustain me for 40. The recording servitor's memory crystals will fill in 25 days if I speak continuously. These are the boundaries of my existence now, measured in days and hours until various systems reach their termination points. I should explain how I came to this position. The archive needs context, and if this recording survives, whoever discovers it should understand what they are hearing. I was born in Memorial Hold's 3rd Administrative District, the son of a manufacturer supervisor and a Medicaid assistant. My father worked in the munitions production facility that supplied the PDF regiments. My mother tended to injured workers in the facility's medical station. They were practical people, focused on function and duty. I disappointed them by preferring reading to mechanical work, by choosing the administratum over the manufactorum. My father told me once that paper pushers were parasites on the Imperium's productive capacity. He said this without malice, just observation. He died when I was 27, crushed between 2 conveyor systems during a machinery malfunction. My mother survived him by 4 years before a lung infection, caused by decades of breathing recycled air in the medical station, killed her. I remember my father's hands. They were scarred from industrial work, the fingers thick and calloused. When he signed my administratum application forms, his grip on the stylus was awkward, unused to writing. But he signed them because duty required it, because the administratum had requested my service, and refusing was unthinkable. I watched him sign and understood that I was leaving his world for another one, that we would not understand each other again. The Schola Progenium taught me to read High Gothic, to operate cogitator systems, to maintain proper documentation protocols. I was an average student in most subjects, exceptional only in memorization and archival taxonomy. These skills earned me the junior scribe position in the administrative offices, where I spent 6 years processing forms that determined which citizens would be conscripted, which districts would receive resource allocations, which violations would result in penal servitude. I was part of the machinery that converted individual lives into data points, that transformed human complexity into manageable categories. I did not enjoy this work, but I performed it competently. Competence earned me notice. Notice earned me the promotion to Archivist Secundus, when the previous holder of that position, a man named Corvus, 63 years old, 30 years of service, died from a cerebral hemorrhage while cataloging birth records from M40. He collapsed between the shelving units. A junior scribe found him 3 hours later. I was assigned to complete his unfinished cataloging work, and during that assignment, I demonstrated sufficient organizational capacity to be offered his position. I accepted. The archive was quieter than the administratum offices, fewer people, more books. I could work for hours without interruption, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of 3,000 years. This suited me. I was not a social person. I preferred the company of preserved records to living colleagues. For 22 years, I existed in that preference. I arrived at the archive sanctum each morning at 6 o'clock. I conducted the daily observance. I worked until 18 o'clock, cataloging new documents, maintaining preservation systems, supervising the 3 junior archivists assigned to my department. I returned to my habitation unit in the 3rd Administrative District. I ate, I read, I slept. The pattern repeated with minimal variation. This was not an unhappy existence. It was simply a narrow one, focused on preservation rather than creation, on maintaining what had been rather than building what might be. I did not question this narrowness. I told myself that preservation was noble work, that the archive served the Imperium by maintaining institutional memory. I believed this in the way one believes things that justify one's choices. Then the enemy arrived, and all those years of careful preservation became irrelevant. The archive I had protected was now entombed, and I was entombed with it. The Imperium I had served had abandoned this world. The pattern I had followed had led me here, to this vault, speaking into a recording servitor because there was nothing else left to do. The Vox receiver crackles again, still no voices. I adjust the frequency manually, sweeping through the emergency channels. Static on every band. Either the enemy has destroyed the Vox relay towers, or everyone who might transmit is dead, or they are hiding in silence like I am hiding in this vault. The last option offers the possibility that I am not alone on this world. But the Vox remains silent, and possibilities without evidence are just comforting lies. I check my chrono, 2013 local time. 6 hours since I sealed the vault. Outside, it is full dark now. Varos Prime's star sets at 1941 this time of year. I have always tracked the sunset times, noting them in my daily log as a measure of seasonal progression. This habit continues even now, even though seasons no longer matter. The enemy does not care what time the sun sets. I should eat something. The nutrient bars are stored in a sealed container near the environmental control panel. I retrieve one and examine it in the luminator light. The packaging is standard administrator issue, beige with black text listing nutritional content and expiration date. This bar expires in 7 months. I will not live 7 months. I open the packaging and bite down on the compressed material inside. It tastes of cardboard and synthetic protein. I chew slowly, deliberately giving my body the fuel it requires to continue functioning. The act of eating feels absurd in this context. I am consuming calories so that I can survive long enough to starve. But I eat anyway because the alternative, lying down and waiting for death, is not a choice I can make yet. I am still performing my duty. I am still the archivist Secundus, responsible for the archive's preservation. As long as I maintain that identity, I have purpose. When that identity dissolves, I will have nothing except time passing in darkness. I think about the junior archivists who served under me. There were 3 of them assigned to my department over the years. The first was a young man named Petron, 24 years old when he arrived, nervous and overly formal. He worked for me for 8 years before transferring to a position in the planetary governor's administrative staff. The second was Davos, older, 39 when assigned, competent but unimaginative. He served 3 years before dying in a transport accident. The shuttle he was riding suffered engine failure and crashed into the Western District. 57 people died in that crash. Davos was reduced to a casualty statistic, his name added to the memorial rolls I maintained in the archive. The third junior archivist was named Silas. He arrived 2 years ago, assigned directly from the Schola Progenium's scribal track. He was 17 years old, young for the position, but his test scores were exceptional. I remember the day he reported for duty. He stood in the archive's entrance corridor, holding his assignment documentation with both hands, staring at the rows of preservation units with an expression I recognized. Wonder, not ambition or duty, but genuine fascination with the accumulated knowledge surrounding him. I assigned him to the document restoration section, routine work, repairing damaged parchments, and re-inking faded texts. He performed the tasks competently, but during break periods, I would find him reading the documents he was supposed to be preserving. He read histories of the planet's founding. He read tactical reports from the Third Sectorial War. He read personal correspondence from colonists describing their first years on Varos Prime. He read everything, absorbing it with an intensity I had not seen in the previous junior archivists. After 3 months, I found him in the vault, this same vault where I now sit. He had descended without authorization, seeking documents from the deepest archives. I should have reprimanded him. Unauthorized access was a violation of protocol. But when I asked him what he was looking for, he looked at me with absolute sincerity and said, "I want to understand who we were before the Imperium came, before the missionaries and the tithes and the war levies. I want to know what we chose to become versus what we were forced to be." This was dangerous thinking. The kind of questioning that could lead to censure or worse. I should have reported it. Instead, I told him, those records exist, but they are restricted. The early colonial period contains ideological variants from current imperial doctrine. Access requires specific clearance. He nodded, understanding the boundaries I was establishing. But then he asked, "Have you read them?" I had. Of course I had. 22 years in the archive meant I had read everything, including the restricted materials. I knew the histories the Imperium preferred to suppress, the secular governance structures the early colonists established, the democratic decision-making processes they employed before the Missionarius Galaxia arrived and converted them. I knew that Varros Prime had not always been an imperial world, that it had been something else first, something that was systematically erased and replaced. I told Silas the truth. Yes, I have read them. And he waited, young and eager and asking me to validate his dangerous curiosity. And they are history, I said. They tell us what happened. They do not tell us what should have happened or what might have been different. History is testimony, not judgment. We preserve it because the Imperium requires institutional memory, not because we endorse every recorded event. This answer satisfied him. Or perhaps it simply taught him to stop asking dangerous questions aloud. He continued his work in the restoration section, and I continued supervising him, and over the following 2 years, we developed what might be called a working relationship based on shared understanding. He knew I had read the restricted materials. I knew he wanted to read them. Neither of us acted on this knowledge, and that mutual restraint created a form of trust. 3 days ago, when the evacuation order was first announced, Silas came to me. The archive was already half empty. The other archivists had departed on the first civilian transports, carrying what documents they could, leaving the rest to whatever fate awaited. Silas stood in the main chamber and asked if I was leaving. I told him I would remain until relieved. He nodded. Then he said, "The restricted materials. If we are abandoning the archive, should we destroy them? Prevent them from falling into enemy hands?" This was correct protocol. In the event of imminent capture, sensitive documents were to be destroyed rather than compromised. But I looked at the vault door and thought about 3,000 years of history reduced to ash because the Imperium could not defend what it had claimed. I thought about the early colonists' records, their naive hopes for governance and society, all erased twice, once by conversion, once by fire. I told Silas, the archive will be sealed. The enemy will not reach it, but if they do, then they will find documents, words on parchment and data in crystals. They will not understand the context. They will not care. We preserve history because it deserves preservation, not because it serves immediate tactical needs. Silas understood what I was really saying. I would not destroy the archive, protocol or not. He accepted this without argument. Then he asked, "Will you evacuate?" "Why not?" I considered multiple answers: duty, responsibility, the necessity of preservation. But what I said was simpler, because someone should remain. Someone should witness what happens here. Someone should record the end. Silas looked at me for a long moment. Then he removed something from his pocket, a small data slate, personal rather than administrative issue. He placed it on my desk. "I have been keeping the journal," he said. "Not official, just observations, thoughts about what I read in the archive, questions I could not ask aloud. If you are staying, if you are recording, perhaps this should be part of that record." I picked up the data slate. It was warm from being carried in his pocket. I asked if he had shown this to anyone else. He said no. I asked if anyone else knew he had been keeping it. He said no again. I understood the risk he was taking by giving it to me. If I reported it, if I documented his questioning and his dangerous curiosity, he could face censure even during evacuation. I placed the data slate in my robes. "I will preserve it," I told him. He nodded. Then he said something I did not expect. "Thank you for not reporting me, for letting me wonder about things even when wondering was dangerous. I did not know how to respond to that. Gratitude for what? For not betraying him? For allowing him to think? These should not be things requiring thanks. But in the Imperium, they were. Thinking outside established patterns was risk. Questioning was risk. I had enabled his risk by not crushing it, and he was grateful for that enabling. Silas left on the final civilian transport yesterday. I watched the shuttle lift from the spaceport, a silver shape rising into gray sky, carrying him and 300 others toward whatever safety the evacuation fleet offered. I never learned if he reached safety. The Vox reports ceased before confirmation of arrival. He is either alive on some ship fleeing this system, or dead in the void, or captured by the enemy. I will never know which, but I have his data slate. It sits on my desk now, next to the recording servitor. I have not read it yet. I am saving it for what purpose I cannot articulate. Perhaps because reading it will make his absence more acute. Perhaps because it represents the last personal connection I possessed before sealing myself in this tomb. Or perhaps because I am rationing the limited sources of humanity remaining to me, saving them for when the isolation becomes unbearable. The chrono displays 21:34. 7 hours in the vault. 33 more hours until I have been here as long as I typically sleep. The time measurements continue, marking duration without progression. I am learning that time in isolation does not pass. It accumulates. I read Silas's data slate on the second day. Not immediately. I spent the first 27 hours maintaining discipline, conducting inventory checks, organizing the preservation units according to priority classifications. Work provided structure, structure prevented thinking. But eventually the tasks were complete, and I was left with silence and the data slate sitting on my desk like an accusation. The entries began 14 months ago, shortly after Silas arrived. The early ones were careful, almost formal. Observations about the archive's organization, notes about documents he found particularly significant. He wrote about a census record from N38 that listed occupations no longer existing. Dream weavers, song architects, memory cultivators. He wondered what these roles entailed, how a society functioned when it valued such abstract labor. The administratum had no classification codes for these occupations. They had been erased from official taxonomy, preserved only in the raw census data that no one bothered to edit. Later entries grew more personal. He described his frustration with the mandatory devotional services, the required prayers to the emperor that consumed 2 hours of each workday. He did not question the emperor's divinity. That would have been heresy beyond even his daring. But he questioned the efficiency, the time lost to ritual when that time could have been spent on actual work. "We pray for the emperor's protection," he wrote. "But protection comes from functioning defense systems and trained soldiers, not from words repeated until they lose meaning." I read this and recognized myself 30 years ago, when I had thought similar thoughts but lacked the courage to write them down. Silas had documented his doubt, made it permanent, trusted me with evidence that could have destroyed him. The weight of that trust settled in my chest like cold stone. The middle entries focused on the restricted materials. He had found ways to access them despite my warnings. Not through official channels, but through simple observation of my routines, learning which vault codes I used, which sections I visited during private research. He read the founding documents, the pre-imperial governance charters, the philosophical treatises the early colonists composed about society and purpose and human dignity. He read materials I had read decades ago and then buried in professional detachment. His reaction was not what I expected. He did not become radicalized or rebellious. Instead, he became mournful. "They tried," he wrote. The founders of Varos Prime genuinely tried to build something different. They established councils where every voice mattered. They created educational systems designed to develop critical thinking rather than obedience. They believed humans could govern themselves through reason and consensus. And then the Imperium arrived, and all of it was dismantled within a generation. Not through violence, through conversion. The missionaries convinced them that their autonomy was arrogance, that their governance was pride, that submission to the emperor was the only righteous path. They surrendered what they had built because they were taught to view it as sin. I stopped reading. The Luminator's light felt too bright suddenly, exposing too much. I was reading the thoughts of a young man who had understood something it took me 40 years to acknowledge. That the Imperium's greatest violence was not its wars, but its erasure of alternatives, its systematic elimination of the possibility that humanity could be anything except what the Imperium required it to be. I resumed reading after 20 minutes of staring at the vault's ceiling. The final entries were written during the evacuation period. Silas described the chaos in Memorial Hold as citizens mobbed the embarkation zones, the PDF soldiers firing warning shots to maintain order, the children separated from parents in the crush of bodies. He wrote about an elderly man who collapsed in the street outside the archive, clutching his chest while hundreds of people stepped around him without stopping. Silas went to help him. The man was already dead. Heart failure, most likely, brought on by stress and exertion. Silas stayed with the body for 40 minutes, waiting for Medicaid personnel who never arrived, eventually leaving the corpse in the street because remaining was futile. I wanted someone to witness his death, Silas wrote. I wanted there to be acknowledgement that this individual person had stopped existing. But there were too many dead, too many dying, and individual deaths became irrelevant against the scale of evacuation. I left him there. I do not know his name. He is not in the casualty records because the casualty records have ceased being updated. He died unmeasured, unrecorded, meaningless. This is what we have become, a civilization so vast that individual death creates no ripple, registers no impact. We are already dead, we just continue moving out of habit. The final entry was dated yesterday, written hours before Silas boarded the evacuation shuttle. It was addressed to me directly. Archivist Kale, I know you will read this. I know you will preserve it, because preservation is what you do, what you have always done. I am giving you this journal because I need someone to understand what I understood, even if that understanding changes nothing. The archive you are protecting contains 3,000 years of institutional memory, but it also contains 3,000 years of systematic forgetting. Every preserved document exists because it served the Imperium's interests. Every destroyed document was eliminated because it contradicted those interests. You are not preserving history. You are preserving a curated version of history, edited to support the power structure that employs you. By staying in the vault, you are not protecting knowledge. You are protecting propaganda. I do not write this to hurt you. I write it because someone should speak the truth before we all die or scatter into the void. The Imperium taught us to view preservation as sacred duty. But preservation of lies is not sacred. It is simply the continuation of the original sin. I am sorry. I am grateful for what you allowed me to learn. I hope you survive. I hope someone survives who can read what you preserve and understand it differently than we were taught to understand it. But I do not believe hope is rational anymore. I sat with those words for 3 hours. The recording servitor remained inactive during this time. I could not speak, could not process my reaction into coherent testimony. Silas had seen what I had spent 22 years avoiding, that my work was not neutral, that preservation within the Imperium's framework meant complicity with the Imperium's erasures. I had convinced myself that maintaining the archive was noble, but nobility was just the story I told myself to avoid acknowledging that I was a component in a machine designed to control truth. The realization did not arrive as dramatic revelation. It settled slowly, like sediment drifting to the bottom of still water. I had been complicit. Not through active malice, but through passive participation, through performing my function without questioning the system that defined that function. I had filed reports on which documents required restricted access. I had supervised the destruction of materials deemed incompatible with imperial doctrine. I had trained junior archivists, including Silas, in the proper protocols for curating history according to administratum guidelines. I had told myself these actions were necessary, that order required structure, that preservation required selectivity. But these were justifications. The truth beneath the justifications was simpler. I had been comfortable. The archive provided purpose, routine, identity. I had not questioned the system because questioning would have required abandoning that comfort, and I was not brave enough to abandon it. Silas had been braver. At 17, he had looked at the system and recognized it for what it was. He had documented his recognition knowing documentation was dangerous. And he had trusted me with that documentation, hoping I would understand what he understood. Now I did, and understanding changed nothing except my relationship to my own choices. I activated the recording servitor and began speaking again. Not because speaking accomplished anything, but because Silas had asked for witness. If I could not change what I had been, I could at least testify to it. The second day passed in deteriorating routine. I conducted the daily observance out of habit, reciting prayers to the Emperor while understanding they were maintenance rituals for my own psychology rather than communication with divine power. I ate another nutrient bar. I checked the environmental systems. I swept through the box channels and heard nothing but static. The world outside remained silent. At 23:17 on the second day, something changed. The vault's external pressure sensors registered movement in the access corridor. Not the pressure change of wind or atmospheric shift, the distinctive pattern of mass displacement caused by physical bodies moving through confined space. Something was in the corridor outside the vault door. Multiple somethings, based on the sensor readings. 17 distinct pressure signatures, each approximately the size and mass of an adult human. I stood from my desk and approached the environmental control panel, where the sensor displays were mounted. The pressure signatures were moving slowly, methodically, as if searching or surveying. They reached the vault door and stopped. For 90 seconds, the sensors registered stationariness. Then the signatures dispersed, moving back down the corridor the way they had come. I waited. The sensors showed empty corridor. Whatever had come had departed. I returned to my desk. My hands were shaking again, more severely than before. I had sealed myself in the vault, assuming I would die of starvation or environmental failure. I had not considered the possibility that the enemy might find me, that the vault's protection might be temporary rather than absolute. If they had reached the access corridor, they had penetrated the archive sanctum's outer defenses. The reinforced walls, the blast doors, none of it had stopped them. But they had not opened the vault. The door remained sealed, the locking bolts engaged. They had approached, investigated, and departed without attempting to breach. This suggested either they lacked the capability to open it, or they had no interest in what lay inside. I did not know which possibility was more disturbing. I recorded the incident in my log, noting the timestamp and sensor readings. Clinical documentation of my own pending death. The pressure signatures returned on the third day. Same pattern. 17 bodies, slow movement, 90 seconds at the vault door. Departure. They repeated this cycle every 8 hours. I began tracking the intervals, building a data set. The enemy was conducting regular patrols or surveys. The vault was not ignored. It was being monitored. I thought about the last pistol. 2 charge packs meant approximately 40 shots. If the enemy breached the vault, if 17 bodies entered, I could potentially kill 3 or 4 before being overwhelmed. This assumed they were vulnerable to last fire, which I could not confirm. It assumed I would have time to aim and fire, which depended on how quickly they moved. It assumed I would choose to fight rather than surrender or negotiate. I did not know what I would choose. The abstract consideration of violence was different from the act itself. I had never killed anyone. I had processed casualty reports, documented deaths as data points, but I had never caused death directly. The last pistol sat in its holster on my desk, unfired, a theoretical tool whose use I could not predict. On the 4th day, the Vox receiver produced something other than static. The transmission was brief. 11 seconds of audio before dissolving back into white noise. A voice, male, speaking Gothic but with pronunciation patterns I did not recognize. The words were distorted, processed through whatever communication system the enemy employed. I heard, "Archive sealed, no resistance detected, proceeding to Sector 7. Then static returned. I replayed the recording 3 times, isolating each word, analyzing the phrasing. The enemy had identified the archive. They knew it was sealed. They had assessed the lack of resistance and moved to other areas. This confirmed what the pressure sensors indicated. They were surveying the city systematically, cataloging what remained. The voice did not sound alien. It sounded human, or close enough to human that my brain registered it as familiar rather than other. This created cognitive dissonance I struggled to process. The Imperium had described the enemy as unknown Xenos, as a threat beyond negotiation or understanding. But Xenos did not speak Gothic. Xenos did not use human communication protocols. Whatever was outside the vault was not as alien as I had been told to expect. This realization destabilized my understanding of the situation. If the enemy was human or human-derived, then this was not a Xenos invasion. It was something else. Renegades, perhaps. Heretics. Forces that had abandoned the Imperium's authority and returned as conquerors. The distinction was significant. Xenos might destroy the archive as incomprehensible alien text. Renegade humans would understand exactly what they were destroying. I thought about Silas's journal, about the restricted materials in the vault, about 3,000 years of documented history that included the Imperium's violence and erasures alongside its glories. If the enemy was human, if they could read what I had preserved, they would find material that contradicted the Imperium's self-presentation. They would find evidence of pre-imperial governance, of alternatives that had been systematically eliminated, of the gap between what the Imperium claimed to be and what it actually was. For the first time since sealing the vault, I considered the possibility that the enemy might not destroy the archive. They might read it. They might understand it differently than I had been trained to understand it, and that understanding might be more dangerous to the Imperium than simple destruction. This thought produced a sensation I could not immediately classify. Not fear, not hope. Something between them. A recognition that my choices had created consequences I had not intended, that preservation could serve purposes beyond what I had imagined. I had sealed myself in the vault to protect the archive from the enemy. But perhaps the archive needed protection from me, from the framework I brought to its interpretation, from the Imperium's control over how history could be understood. I recorded these thoughts, speaking them aloud to the servitor, because speaking made them real in a way that thinking did not. Then I returned to waiting. The pressure signatures continued their 8-hour cycles. The Vox receiver produced occasional bursts of distorted communication, fragments of enemy coordination, logistical reports, casualty assessments. I compiled them into a fragmentary narrative. The enemy had secured Memorial Hold with minimal resistance. PDF forces had either evacuated or surrendered. Civilian casualties were described as negligible, which meant thousands dead, but not enough to impact operational objectives. The enemy was establishing occupation infrastructure, converting Imperial facilities to their own purposes. On the 7th day, the pressure signatures changed pattern. Instead of 17 bodies, the sensors registered 3. They moved directly to the vault door without the previous slow survey approach. They remained for 4 minutes instead of 90 seconds. Then they departed. I checked the vault's structural integrity sensors. No damage, no attempted breach. They had examined the door more closely, but had not tried to force it. This suggested they were evaluating options, planning a methodical approach rather than immediate assault. I began preparing for breach. I arranged the archive's most critical documents in a specific section of the vault, materials that would burn quickly if I needed to destroy them before capture. The restricted materials, the pre-imperial governance records, Silas's journal, evidence of alternatives, of questions, of human possibility beyond what the Imperium permitted. These were the documents that mattered most, paradoxically because they were the ones my duty required me to destroy. But I did not destroy them. Instead, I organized them for easy access, for rapid preservation or rapid elimination depending on circumstances I could not predict. I was preparing to make a choice I had avoided making for 22 years. Whether preservation meant protecting the archive from everyone, or whether it meant allowing the archive to be read, understood, and potentially used against the system that created it. On the 9th day, I heard the first physical sound from outside the vault, not pressure signatures on sensors, actual sound transmitted through the rockcrete and plasteel, a deep, rhythmic percussion, drilling. They were cutting through the access corridor's reinforced walls, approaching the vault from an oblique angle. The sound lasted for 7 hours before stopping. During that time, I sat at my desk and calculated trajectories. If they cut through 3 meters of reinforced corridor wall, they would reach the vault's external structure. From there, they would need to penetrate an additional 2 meters of plasteel to breach the actual chamber. At their current cutting rate, this would require approximately 16 hours of continuous work. I had 16 hours to decide what to do. The drilling resumed on the 10th day. The sound was louder now, closer. I could hear variations in pitch and rhythm, different tools being employed, different materials being cut. They were adapting their approach, working methodically through the archive sanctum's defensive layers. I imagined the enemy soldiers operating the cutting equipment, working in shifts, patient and professional. The image I constructed was not monstrous. It was mundane, workers performing a task, same as any Imperial work crew. This mundanity disturbed me more than alien horror would have. Horror could be categorized, processed, survived through detachment. Mundanity was intimate. It suggested the enemy was human in all the ways that mattered. Organized, purposeful, patient. They would breach the vault not through overwhelming force, but through steady application of standard engineering techniques. I thought about Silas. If he had survived the evacuation, he was somewhere in the void now, traveling toward Imperial space or whatever safe harbor the evacuation fleet sought. He would never know what happened in this vault. He would never learn whether I had understood his final message, whether his trust had been justified. His journal would either burn with me or be captured with the archive, but either way he would not receive confirmation that his testimony mattered. This bothered me more than my own impending death. I had spent 22 years preserving other people's words, ensuring their voices persisted beyond their lives. But Silas's voice would persist only if I made choices that contradicted my training, that betrayed my institutional loyalty, that transformed preservation into something the Imperium would call treason. The drilling stopped at hour 14. Not pausing, stopping completely, the silence was immediate and total. I checked the structural sensors. The enemy had cut through to the vault's outer shell. They were approximately 30 centimeters from breakthrough, 30 centimeters of plasteel between me and whatever waited outside. But they had stopped cutting. For 6 hours, nothing happened. The pressure signatures showed 3 bodies positioned near the cutting site, stationary waiting. I could not determine why. Then the Vox receiver activated, not static this time. A clear transmission, directed specifically to the vault's emergency frequency. A voice speaking Gothic with perfect pronunciation, no distortion, calm and professional. Archivist Secundus Matthias Kale. We know you are alive in the vault. We have monitored your environmental systems and detected active power consumption consistent with single human occupancy. We do not wish to harm you. We are breaching the vault to secure the archive, not to execute survivors. If you can hear this transmission, please acknowledge. I sat frozen at my desk. They knew my name. They knew my position. They had been monitoring me for 10 days, gathering data, confirming my presence before making contact. This was not random enemy action. This was targeted intelligence gathering. The voice continued, "We understand you may be unwilling to communicate. Imperial conditioning teaches that surrender is dishonor, that death is preferable to capture. But we are not the enemy you have been taught to expect. We are the Reclamation Movement, former imperial citizens who rejected the administrator's authority. We do not seek your death. We seek your knowledge. The archive you are protecting contains documentation that the Imperium has suppressed, history that contradicts official narratives. This documentation is valuable to our cause. We will breach the vault within 4 hours. You may destroy the restricted materials before we arrive, as protocol requires, or you may preserve them. The choice is yours. But understand, if you choose destruction, you are eliminating evidence that could change how humans understand their own history. Consider what preservation truly means before you act. The transmission ended. Static returned. I sat listening to that static for 11 minutes before I could think coherently. They knew about the restricted materials. They knew the archive contained suppressed history. They had not come to destroy the archive. They had come specifically because the archive existed, because it held evidence they needed. And they had told me this, given me time to choose, presented destruction or preservation as my decision rather than forcing one outcome through violence. This was sophisticated psychological manipulation. By framing the choice as mine, they transferred moral responsibility to me. If I destroyed the materials, I became the censor. If I preserved them, I became the collaborator. Either way, they had converted me from neutral archivist into active participant in their conflict with the Imperium. But the manipulation only worked because they were correct. The choice was mine. It had always been mine. Every time I filed a document as restricted, every time I supervised destruction of materials deemed incompatible with Imperial doctrine, I had been making choices that shaped what history looked like. I had told myself I was following protocol, that the administratum's decisions were not my decisions. But that was a comfortable lie. I had agency. I had always had agency. I simply had not acknowledged it because acknowledging it would have required accepting responsibility. Now I could not avoid that responsibility. The enemy, the Reclamation Movement they called themselves, had forced acknowledgement by giving me explicit choice. Destroy or preserve, censor or testify. Continue serving the system that had defined my existence, or break from that system in the final hours of my life. I looked at the restricted materials I had organized for rapid destruction. 3,000 years of suppressed history, evidence of alternatives, proof that humanity had tried to be something other than what the Imperium made it. Silas had read these materials and understood their significance. He had trusted me to understand as well. I picked up the Les pistol, checked the charge pack, confirmed it was loaded and functional. Then I placed it back on the desk without activating it. I was not going to destroy the archive. I was going to let them breach the vault. I was going to preserve the materials, not because I supported their rebellion, but because preservation was what the archive deserved. Preservation beyond the Imperium's control, beyond my control. Preserved so it could be read and understood by whoever remained to read and understand. This was my complicity moment. Not the complicity of the previous 202 years, but active, conscious complicity. I was choosing to betray my oath, my institution, my training. I was choosing to allow the archive to serve purposes I had been taught to prevent. And I was making this choice not because I believed the Reclamation Movement was righteous, but because I believed the archive was more important than my loyalty to any particular power structure. I recorded this decision, speaking it into the servitor so there would be documentation of my reasoning. If I survived breach, if they interrogated me, I wanted evidence that this was deliberate choice rather than cowardice or confusion. I wanted Silas to know, even though he would never hear this recording, that his trust had not been misplaced, that I had finally understood what he had been trying to teach me. The drilling resumed 3 hours later. The final 30 centimeters of plasteel took 90 minutes to penetrate. I sat at my desk listening to the sound grow louder, closer, more immediate. The structural integrity sensors registered failure at multiple points. Then, at hour 17, since they began cutting, the drilling stopped. Silence for 40 seconds. Then a new sound. Hydraulic tools forcing the cut section of wall outward, controlled collapse rather than explosive breach. They were entering carefully, professionally, treating the vault as a site requiring preservation rather than a target requiring assault. The cut section fell inward with a sound like thunder compressed into 3 seconds. Dust billowed through the opening, illuminated by harsh luminator light from outside. I remained seated at my desk, hands visible, las pistol untouched. 3 figures entered through the breach. They wore armor I recognized, Imperial Guard flak armor, standard issue, marked with unit insignias from the Varus Prime PDF. But the insignias had been modified, the Imperial Aquila scratched away and replaced with a symbol I did not recognize, a circle containing a stylized human hand reaching upward. The Reclamation Movement's mark, presumably. The first soldier through the breach carried a las rifle but kept it pointed downward, non-threatening. He looked at me, at the organized archive surrounding us, at the recording servitor still active on my desk. Then he removed his helmet. He was perhaps 35 years old, scarred face, augmetic left eye, the weathered appearance of long military service. When he spoke, his voice matched the Vox transmission. Archivist Secundus Kale. You did not destroy the materials. No, I said. My voice was steady despite 11 days of isolation. I did not. Why not? I considered multiple answers. Because I was too weak to make that choice. Because I no longer believed in the Imperium's right to control history. Because a 17-year-old archivist had trusted me to understand something, and I finally did. What I said was simpler. Because the archive deserves to exist beyond any one government's authority. History should outlive the systems that create it. The soldier studied me for several seconds. Then he nodded. We will preserve it. Everything you maintained here will be documented, copied, and distributed. The Imperium erased our alternatives once. We will not allow them to do it again. I understood then what the Reclamation Movement was. Not conquerors, but curators. Not destroyers, but preservers. They were doing what I should have been doing all along, maintaining history not to serve power, but to document truth, regardless of whose interests that truth contradicted. The soldiers spent 4 days cataloging the archive. They brought equipment, scanning servitors, data crystal duplicators, preservation units for transporting physical documents. They worked with the carefulness of people who understood the archive's value, who treated each document as irreplaceable. They asked me questions about the organizational system, the restricted materials, the gaps in the official records. I answered everything. There was no reason to withhold information anymore. My duty had been to the archive, not to the Imperium's version of it. On the 3rd day, one of the soldiers found Silas's journal. He brought it to me and asked what it was. I explained. Personal documentation by a junior archivist. Observations about the archive and the restricted materials. Dangerous questions that could not be asked aloud. The soldier read several entries, then looked at me and said, "This is exactly what we need. Personal testimony from inside the system, documentation of how the Imperium suppresses thought even in its own archivists. May we include this in the distributed archive?" I thought about Silas on his evacuation shuttle, fleeing into the void. I thought about his hope that someone would understand what he understood, that his testimony would matter. I said, yes, preserve it. Let his questions outlive the system that made asking them dangerous. They copied the journal along with everything else. Silas's words would be distributed across whatever network the Reclamation Movement maintained, read by people who had rejected imperial authority, used as evidence that alternatives existed. His testimony would matter after all, though not in any way the Imperium would recognize as legitimate. On the 14th day, they finished cataloging. The lead soldier, I learned his name was Vartan, former PDF captain, 15 years of service before defecting, returned to the vault one final time. He told me they were evacuating the remaining archival staff they had found, offering them positions in the Reclamation movement's own preservation initiatives. He asked if I wanted to join them. I considered this. I was 53 years old. I had spent 22 years serving a system I now understood to be fundamentally corrupt. I could continue serving, redirect my skills toward the Reclamation movement's purposes, spend whatever years remained to me preserving history for different masters. Or I could remain in the vault, stay with the archive I had maintained, the physical space that had defined my existence for 2 decades. The Reclamation movement would take copies, but the originals would remain here, in this sealed chamber beneath a dead city on an abandoned world. Someone should stay with them. Someone should continue the work of preservation even after the work had lost strategic or political value. I told Vartan I would remain. He accepted this without argument. He understood, I think, that some forms of duty exist independent of politics, that preservation could be an end in itself rather than a means to someone else's objectives. He left me with supplies, nutrient bars, water reclamation tablets, replacement parts for the environmental systems, enough to sustain me for 6 months, perhaps longer if I rationed carefully. They sealed the breach they had created, welding new plasteel plates over the opening. The vault returned to its isolated state, but now I knew what waited outside. Not enemies, but people who had read the archive and understood it differently than the Imperium permitted. The knowledge changed the quality of my isolation. I was no longer waiting for rescue. I was simply continuing to exist alongside the materials I had preserved. The recording servitor's memory crystals are 87% full now. I've been speaking to it for 21 days. My voice has changed over that time, initially controlled and professional, gradually becoming more fractured, more willing to acknowledge doubt and complicity, and the moral compromises I made over 22 years of service. This testimony has been the process of acknowledging what I was and what I enabled. I think about the Imperium often, about its scale, 1 million worlds, countless billions of humans, resources and labor and knowledge extracted from thousands of civilizations and converted into machinery that perpetuates itself. I was one component in that machinery, so small as to be irrelevant in any calculation of the system's function. But I was still a component. I processed information, curated history, trained successors. The system continued because people like me performed our functions without questioning whether those functions served anything beyond the system's self-perpetuation. The Imperium consumes. This is not metaphor. It literally consumes resources, labor, lives, alternatives, possibilities. It encounters difference and converts it into sameness. It finds societies that have built their own solutions to human problems and teaches them that those solutions are inadequate, that only submission to the Emperor provides righteousness. It does not conquer through pure force. It conquers through the conversion of identity, through making people believe that what they were before the Imperium arrived was wrong, sinful, pitiable. I participated in that conversion by preserving the evidence of it while restricting access to evidence of what came before. I told myself restriction was necessary, that not everyone could be trusted with challenging information. But that belief was how the Imperium maintained control, by convincing its servants that control was necessary, that humans could not be trusted with their own history, that freedom of knowledge was dangerous rather than essential. Silas understood this at 17. It took me 53 years and the destruction of my entire world to understand what he understood immediately. The archive I protected was simultaneously proof of the Imperium's reach and proof of what the Imperium destroyed. Every document I preserved testified to both the system's power and the alternatives it eliminated. I had spent 2 decades maintaining evidence of erasure, while telling myself I was preserving history. But history without context is not history. It is propaganda, and context is what the Imperium systematically eliminated. The restricted materials provided that context. They showed that humans had tried other ways of organizing society, other values beyond service and sacrifice, other relationships to authority beyond submission. The Imperium erased these attempts not because they failed, but because they succeeded well enough to threaten Imperial control. The Reclamation movement understood this. They came to Varos Prime not for territory or resources, but for the archive, for documentation of alternatives, for proof that the Imperium's narrative was constructed rather than inevitable. They will use what I preserved to challenge that narrative, to demonstrate to other worlds that rebellion is possible, that the Imperium's authority rests on controlled information rather than absolute truth. I do not know if their rebellion will succeed. The Imperium has crushed countless rebellions over 10,000 years. Scale is on the Imperium's side. More ships, more soldiers, more resources, more worlds willing to die in the Emperor's name. But scale is also the Imperium's vulnerability. A system that vast cannot monitor everything. Information leaks, spreads, creates doubt in places the Imperium cannot immediately suppress. The archive's contents will leak. Silas's journal will be read. Somewhere, someone will encounter evidence that alternatives existed and will wonder why those alternatives were erased. That wondering is what the Imperium fears most. Not violence, not military defeat, but the thought that propagates through populations, the question that cannot be answered except through force, the doubt that converts compliance into resistance. I have become part of that doubt's propagation. By choosing not to destroy the restricted materials, by allowing the Reclamation movement to copy and distribute them, I have enabled the spread of information the Imperium would kill to suppress. This makes me a traitor. By the Imperium's standards, I have committed heresy, betrayed my oaths, violated the trust granted to archivists throughout Imperial space. If the Imperium reclaims Varos Prime, if they discover what I did, they will execute me with the same mechanical efficiency they bring to all institutional functions. My name will be stricken from records. The archive will be purged. Nothing I did will matter except as cautionary example to future archivists about the consequences of doubt. But the Imperium will not reclaim Varos Prime. The evacuation fleet abandoned us 12 days ago. The Reclamation movement controls the planet now, has established occupation government in Memorial Hold and the other surviving cities. They are building something here, not a return to pre-imperial governance, but something new, synthesized from recovered alternatives and contemporary needs. I will not live to see what they build, but I preserve the materials that make their attempt possible. Silas would approve. He wanted someone to witness, someone to understand, someone to act on that understanding, even when action meant betraying everything we had been taught to value. I witnessed, I understood, I acted. The actions came 22 years too late, after thousands of documents had already been destroyed, after countless alternatives had been erased on my watch. But they came. The environmental systems will fail in approximately 40 days. The nutrient bars will last 33 days. I will die here in this vault, surrounded by the archive I spent my life maintaining. No one will retrieve my body. The vault will become my tomb, sealed beneath a world that no longer belongs to the Imperium that commissioned this facility. Future historians, if the Reclamation movement produces historians, might find this recording. They might understand what happened here. How one archivist chose preservation over loyalty in the final days of his life. Or they might not find it. The recording servitor might fail before anyone breaches the vault again. This testimony might dissolve into corrupted data, another voice lost among billions that the Imperium and its enemies have silenced. The uncertainty does not trouble me. I am recording because recording is what archivists do, because testimony matters even when no one receives it, because consciousness continuing in isolation requires purpose beyond mere survival. I think about my mother sometimes. She died believing I was serving the Imperium honorably, that my work in the archive contributed to humanity's greatness. She never questioned the system that extracted her labor for 43 years before killing her with lung infections caused by inadequate environmental controls. She believed her suffering was necessary, that the Imperium required sacrifice, that the Emperor valued her service even as the system treated her as expendable. I cannot believe that anymore. The Emperor, if he exists as anything beyond institutional mythology, does not value individual service. He cannot. At the scale the Imperium operates, individuals are invisible. My mother's death mattered to me. It did not matter to the manufacturum that killed her, or the administratum that processed her casualty report, or the Imperium that replaced her with another worker within 3 days. She was interchangeable, valuable only as function, meaningless once that function ceased. I am equally meaningless at institutional scale. The archive I maintained will be replicated and distributed. My role in its preservation will be footnote at best, more likely unmentioned. The Imperium will not memorialize me. The reclamation movement will not honor me. I will simply stop existing, and both systems will continue without pause or acknowledgement. But meaning is not determined by institutional recognition. Silas mattered to me, not because the Imperium valued him, but because I witnessed his struggle with questions too dangerous to ask aloud. My mother mattered, not because her death registered in any significant calculation, but because I remember her hands, scarred from industrial work, teaching me to read when I was 5 years old. Meaning exists in these individual connections, in the specific rather than the general, in the act of witness rather than the judgment of history. I am completing this recording not because it will change anything, but because completing it is the final act of witness I can perform. I witnessed 3,000 years of history. I witnessed Silas's dangerous questions. I witnessed my own complicity with a system designed to erase alternatives. I witnessed the reclamation movement's attempt to recover what was erased. And now I witness my own ending, conscious and documented, preserving testimony until the environmental systems fail and consciousness follows. The archive remains. The documents I organized sit in their preservation units, temperature and humidity controlled, protected from degradation. When I die, they will continue existing without me. They will outlast the Imperium that commissioned them and the reclamation movement that copied them. Paper and data crystals have no loyalty. They simply persist, carrying their information forward through time, waiting for readers who will understand them in ways I cannot predict. This is what preservation means. Not control, not curation, but allowing materials to exist beyond any one person's or institution's authority, trusting that future readers will find meaning that current authorities would suppress. I failed at this for 22 years. I succeeded in the final 14 days. The ratio is not favorable, but the success matters more than its lateness. I am Archivist Secundus Matthias Kale. I was born 53 years ago in Memorial Hold's 3rd Administrative District. I served the Imperium for 31 years before I understood what that service enabled. I sealed myself in this vault, believing I was protecting the archive from enemies. I remained in the vault after learning that the archive needed protection from the Imperium, not from those the Imperium called enemies. I do not regret my choice. I regret only that the choice came so late, after so much had already been lost. But late choice is still choice, and choice is the demonstration of agency the Imperium works constantly to eliminate. By choosing, I became something other than component. I became witness, testimony, evidence that even the most thoroughly conditioned servant can recognize complicity and choose differently. The recording servitor's memory crystals are 94% full. When they reach capacity, this testimony will end. I will continue existing for perhaps 30 more days. But existence without documentation is not testimony. It is simply waiting. I am approaching the boundary between witness and silence, between preserved consciousness and erasure. I think this is appropriate. Archivists exist at that boundary, collecting voices before they dissolve into time's progression, preserving testimony so that silence does not become absolute. I have preserved thousands of voices. Now I preserve my own, speaking into a servitor that will outlast me by decades, leaving evidence that I witnessed what I witnessed and chose as I chose. The city outside is silent. The reclamation movement has moved to other districts, other cities, other worlds perhaps. The vault returns to isolation, no longer monitored, no longer strategically relevant. Just a sealed chamber beneath a conquered city on an abandoned world, containing one archivist and 3,000 years of documented history. We wait together, the archive and I, for whatever comes next, recovery or oblivion, readers or eternal silence. I am ready for either. The archive is preserved, Silas's journal is copied and distributed. The restricted materials exist beyond Imperial control. I have completed the work that mattered. What remains is just duration until duration ends. The Emperor protects. They told us this constantly, turned it into liturgy, made it the foundation of Imperial faith. But protection was never the Imperium's purpose. The purpose was perpetuation. The system protects itself by consuming everything that might threaten it, including the people who serve it most faithfully. I was consumed slowly, over 22 years, converted into component through routine and ritual, and the comfortable lie that my work was noble. But consumption is not absolute. Even consumed components retain traces of what they were before consumption. Somewhere in those traces, capacity for choice persists. Silas found that capacity at 17. I found it at 53. The timing matters less than the finding. This is my final testimony. I was an archivist who served the Imperium until I understood what that service enabled. I preserved history according to protocols designed to limit what history could say. I betrayed those protocols in the final days of my life, choosing preservation over loyalty, testimony over compliance. I do not know if this betrayal will matter beyond this vault, but it matters to me, and mattering is what consciousness requires to justify its continuation. The recording servitor indicates 98% capacity, 2% remaining. I will speak until the crystals fill completely, then sit in silence until the environmental systems fail. The silence will be longer than the testimony, duration exceeding documentation. But the documentation will persist. Someone will find this. Someone will hear an archivist's voice describing his complicity and his final choice. Someone will understand that even within systems designed to eliminate agency, choice remains possible until consciousness itself ceases. I am Matthias Kale. I witnessed the end of Varos Prime. I preserved what could be preserved. I testified to what I observed. This is the final log of a dead world's last librarian. Recorded because recording is what librarians do, because testimony matters even when history has already rendered its judgment, because consciousness deserves documentation until the moment it ceases to continue. The crystals are full. The testimony is complete. What remains is only waiting. I wait.